Sounds like an exciting film, starring Ken Baldwin and Iain McGill and Tim Nelson. So I think Ken is going to start with a wee introduction. We're going to run it slightly differently to the previous one. So Ken will do a quick introduction, then Iain will do his presentation. We'll have a few questions afterwards, then Tim will talk, and again, questions, and then Ken will have the last word. Looking forward to it.
Thank you very much, Ivan. And indeed, this is a bit of an interactive program that we're proposing here today, because what we're doing is presenting the outcomes of the Future Electricity Markets Summit. How do I do this? There we go. Which was held in November. And indeed, this is a learning process for Australia as well. So it's really about thinking beyond the horizon to the point where we're in a 100% renewable energy, zero carbon environment. How do you run an electricity market under those circumstances, given the massive change in the technologies, in the control systems, in the economics, in the policy space that are going to happen? And this summit was brought together through a collaboration between the Australian Energy Market Operator as part of the Energy Security Board with the AEMC, Australian Energy Market Commission, to look into the future. They asked us at the Australian National University, where I work, to partner with them, and through me as the chair of the Energy Research Institute's Council for Australia, which is a dozen university research organisations with energy institutes, to do some brainstorming about this future space. And we also partnered with the International Energy Agency, who are very keen on looking at Australia, as I'll tell you, for a number of reasons. The summit attracted over 150 participants. It was full on for 3 days of brainstorming and over-the-horizon thinking. And what we'd like to do today is share some of that, but also discuss it with you to see if there are views that you have. And really the aim of this summit was obviously not to design a market right now. What we needed to understand were the key parameters that would feed into that. What were the challenges, the issues, the barriers of moving forward into a totally decarbonised electricity sector, and how does that best operate? So this is a work in progress, and hopefully the next step will be to take the learnings from this and from the feedback we get at conferences like today's, and feed that into the next process, which will actually be the nitty-gritty of actually designing something in 2030, 2040, something along that time frame. So why Australia? Okay, so first of all, how do I forward this? I do a right click, nothing happens. There we go, managed to get it. Okay, so why Australia? Well, for a number of reasons. Okay, so Australia is an island with enormous renewable energy resources, solar and wind primarily, and it also happens to have the world's longest interconnected electricity system, over 5,000 kilometres. So it's a very long and skinny grid. As you can see, this is from the AEMO Integrated System Plan figure for system strength. And as a result, it is very prone to issues of system security, and the issues only become more enhanced when you go to intermittent variable renewable energy as the key generating source. So that's reason number one, why this is of an international interest. And in fact, Australia perhaps is viewed as a little bit of a sandpit for experiment on what might happen into the future, because not only do we have this unique system, which is not interconnected with another nation, so it's totally standalone, but it's also leading the world in the transition away from fossil fuels to renewable energy. And you might say that, you know, the Australian electricity system, 75% fossil fuels currently, is one of the highest intensity fossil fuels electricity networks in the world, but it is also transitioning away from that at the fastest rate. So we're installing solar and wind at around 6.4 gigawatts per annum. That's 4 gigawatts per annum large scale and 2.4 gigawatts per annum rooftop solar. In fact, we have the highest penetration rate of rooftop solar in the world at over 20%. Just recently, we've reached the point where we have 25% renewable energy in the mix. And if you look at it on a per capita basis, so you simply divide by the population, then what you come up with is that we lead the world with 250 watts per person per capita wind and solar installation rate, and that's the fastest in the world by a long way. So that's why it's interesting. Also of interest is the fact that we're close to Asia. That's where the biggest energy demand growth is going to be going ahead into the next few decades. You can see from there that 2/3 of the world's energy growth is going to happen in our region, and Australia is a big exporter into Asia for energy. And this is the only ANU slide that you're going to see in this presentation. It's work that we've done in a grand challenge for which we've been funded $10 million over the next 5 years. It's to look at the energy export prospects of converting our current fossil fuel exports into renewables. So the map on the left shows that we're a big exporter of natural gas and thermal coal as well as iron ore, and this produces the consequential emissions in megatons of CO2 per year. You can see in those numbers, most of which gets burnt or used in the Asian region, and it contributes around 11% to the Asia-Pacific's energy emissions. Looking ahead, what we want to see is a way forward so that Australia can remain an energy export powerhouse, and in the future base this on renewable energy. So let's say that the demand that we have over here for our energy and thermal coal and gas in energy units is converted in the future into hydrogen and direct electricity through undersea cable export. Okay, so the consequence of making that demand fulfilled from renewable energy in the future is shown in these numbers here in terms of terawatt hours per year and megatons of green hydrogen being exported. And the other thing that we look at doing is converting the iron ore into green steel using renewable electricity and hydrogen to reduce the iron ore into iron and then into steel. And this generates 530 megatons a year of green steel. To do that takes a solar and wind farm, half each, the size of this green dot up here in the northwest of Australia, which is a relevant area because that has the world's best wind and solar resource right next to the world's biggest iron ore reserves. And if you do those numbers, and you've probably done them in your head already, what that amounts to is 20 times the domestic electricity production of Australia currently, which is 260 terawatt hours a year. So this export industry, which is simply replacing the energy exports we have now with renewable energy exports in the future, is going to be absolutely the dominant form of energy production in the country. So if you think about this in terms of what the cost is going to be as we go forward to balance electricity, everyone's sort of seen numbers like this. You know, you need roughly 50% of the cost of electricity to have firm supply through more transmission and more storage. Let's say we move into 100% renewables domestic economy in Australia. That's over on the left. Then we might need to electrify the other sectors. That makes us maybe a 200 or 300% renewables economy. But now we add in this massive export opportunity up to maybe 2,000% renewables. So what effect does that have on the cost of electricity? Well, who knows? Maybe it does this, maybe it does that. Maybe if you start doing it early enough, you can get off that curve and the costs will be driven down even earlier. This just shows what a significant issue the Australian electricity market is going to be into the future when you couple it with not only domestic electrification but also exports. So this is a massive challenge, okay? And we have to think over the horizon and think about how this is going to work in a future electricity market that rewards all the things that we know and love: supply of energy, supply of capacity, frequency and voltage control, etc. Okay, so if Australia can successfully navigate this transition with one of the most carbon intensive existing sectors, the world's fastest growing wind and solar adoption rate, the longest and skinniest national grid, no neighbours to help us, and with the potential for exports to absolutely dwarf the national electricity market, then perhaps anyone can. And that's really the reason that we undertook this exercise. So here's the outline for our presentations today. Iain McGill will now talk about these different themes from the conference. Tim Nelson will talk about the other themes. I'll finish up just summarising those last two themes, and we'll have Q&A in between. Thank you very much.
Okay, hi everyone, and thanks for that intro, Ken. And one thing I would say is, I'm picking up on 3 of the 9 themes that came up over the summit's 3 days, but there's linkages between those and what Tim's going to be talking about and what Ken's already flagged, for example, sector coupling and so on. So feel free to think quite widely as you contribute to what we decide and try and work out what to do next. Okay. Yeah, let me just go to that. Okay, so the national electricity market in Australia has just turned 20. So happy birthday. It was the 13th of December 1999 that it formally kicked off. And on its 15th anniversary, there was, I would say, a fair amount of quiet satisfaction among many of the stakeholders about what had been achieved. And in fact, the Australian Energy Market Commission, which was guiding the process for the NEM at that time, and KPMG put out a joint report on the national electricity market as a case study in successful microeconomic reform. So feel free to ask Tim about that. I mean, some might say this was peak hubris, because as we sort of turn 20, there's a wide range of generally accepted challenges that the national electricity market's struggling to deal with. This is from the Energy Security Board, and as Ken noted, they actually were one of the organisations that put in to try and make this summit happen, has sort of assessed the current and sort of outlook for a range of issues, be it affordability for consumers, security, reliable low emissions supply, open and competitive markets, timely investment in networks and so on. And as you can see, there's a lot of red here. We're sort of critical, maybe getting better, critical, staying critical, getting worse, maybe getting better, staying the same, maybe getting a little bit better. Okay, so not everyone agrees with this. I think Paul might be here. I can't see him. Yeah, he's sort of a don't panic, keep calm and carry on about it. But I think widely accepted, some pretty serious challenges. Less agreement on what's causing them and what are solutions. And it's interesting if you note this table here, there's a mix, it's about outcomes, affordability, security and so on, but there's one what I would call means sitting in there, which is the open and competitive markets, because the markets are a means, not an end, all right? And you might notice that and think, it's a little bit strange, things are going terribly, but in terms of the means we're using to drive decision-making in this electricity industry, they're just fine. So you might sort of scratch your head and say, is that actually coherent? But it's a challenge, and it ties into this market design question. It's bigger than a market design question. That's, I think, the key thing. So I was responsible for I'm responsible today for sort of presenting on 3 of the summit sessions. Now note there were presentations for each of those, and I should declare an interest. I was a presenter in the end-to-end, which I'll start with. There were breakout discussions. There's draft papers under preparation, and I should put in a disclaimer at this point. I've borrowed freely, added my own perspectives, and I make no claim to be presenting consensus views. There was some consensus that emerged, but it's the usual thing of what can we agree on and what do we really disagree on, and then what might we do about it. So, just with that proviso, let's start with end-to-end market design. Let's start with the Australian national electricity market. 2 key things. It's not national, and it's mostly a power system, and the market, of course, is a decision-making mechanism sitting on top, but our starting point is all the crunchy stuff down here that actually does the job of delivering electricity to provide energy services. Now, sitting between the physical industry and these markets is our Australian Energy Market Operator, for which for international guests here is really a combined independent system operator as well as a market operator. And there's many good reasons to put those together. Now, if we think about end-to-end, the orange here is the markets, pretty much as currently constructed, with some very rough estimates of the money going through. And so about 40 billion in this retail market here between consumers and these completely artificial market constructs called retailers. They have no physical role, okay, they're just an intermediary. We have a wholesale market that gets most of the attention between large generators and retailers and large consumers. There's an incredibly important and neglected derivative market sitting around that because investors need future prices, not current prices or spot prices. Almost half the money disappears off into a non-market area, right, which is the network businesses, which are economically regulated monopolies. So you might say end-to-end is really from this wholesale through to retail, and you might say markets here, and that's the majority of the money, but about 40% of the money, depends on the wholesale market and what pricing we see, heads down out of the market pretty much straight away. Okay. So that was a simple presentation of the national electricity market. It's only getting more complex, right? So we've got new players coming in, we've got networks trying to work on business models with consumers, aggregators and a range of other things. We'll talk a little bit more about some of that activity, but it's only getting more complex. And so that's the challenge right there. And we're still trying to think, okay, which markets are in and which markets are out of end-to-end market design. But it's even worse, right? Because if you just focus on the markets, you miss this broader story that market design sits within an external policy context, from everything from climate, renewables, fuel choices, social welfare, economic development, and the electricity industry always needs a strong technical and regulatory framework as well, because you've got to make this thing work. And electricity markets are very much a designer market. They're a construct, and it's got to try and work side to side as well as from end to end. And so a lot of the discussion in this session was really around those interfaces. This is not just a market design problem that we face. We've got to get this broader context right. Okay, one of the big things that came up was around externalities in market design. And the first thing is, often when you hear externality, everyone thinks climate change, and yeah, it's certainly an externality in many electricity industries around the world and energy sectors more generally. But electricity, of course, has a wide range of externalities. There's positive and negative. There's externalities, which are things like security, which aren't always priced currently. So at one level, it's something important which isn't currently priced. And so how do you do market design when some really key values aren't currently sitting in any market and seeing any price? And it's important to note that most decision-making in electricity industries has a pretty strong non-market aspect to it. The International Energy Agency's kind of estimates are that investment in the power sector, driven by wholesale markets, right? Wholesale markets driving everything, and it's just a market thing. It's private players doing generation investment. They reckon that might be 3% of global electricity sector investment, because there's all this other stuff, networks, distributed generation with the policy support there, it's a mix, and then all of the various renewable support and other things we see. So the electricity industry is actually dominated by policy and regulatory drivers. And the next thing that's an issue here is, if markets have significant externalities, they are inefficient by design, because there's something that matters that this market doesn't price. You may be lucky. It may be this market delivers it even though it isn't being paid for it. But there's every chance, in fact we often see it, the margins in externalities, right? So what you'll often see is actually things which make a market more efficient in itself. If there are large externalities, it can actually make the overall market more inefficient. And I think there's some strong examples in the Australian national electricity market over there where you can say, let's make signalling for transmission investment for new renewables projects more economically efficient. Fine, but you haven't priced the carbon externality into our electricity industry, and every time you delay renewables projects, you pay an externalities price in terms of climate change. So we've really got to think, again, it comes to this broader framework. Okay, here's some things that are sort of coming in the draft session paper. I should acknowledge Ryan Espelin, AEMC, who's sort of driving this. I don't think we've got complete agreement on it, but let me run through them. We certainly need to look for consistent, integrated and robust market design. And so working away on some market, let's say the wholesale electricity market, without thinking about the way that might impact on the retail market, for example, is problematic. We need to be integrated. We should be seeking to internalise key externalities, not just climate. There are other externalities which currently aren't priced but are important. We need greater consideration of the demand side. You can actually go back far enough with the Australian Energy Market Commission. They were arguing that retail competition worked in the national electricity market because it was a homogenous low engagement activity, and that meant new entry was straightforward. And you might sort of scratch your head and go, okay, it's a real, it's a competitive market because the buy side isn't engaged. It sounds problematic. Perhaps you heard Bruce speaking on our retail market design earlier today. But we are going to have to get the demand side participating better in these markets if we want to be assured of good outcomes. Security services do need to be incentivised. There's markets that got a role, but there's lots of other things required as well. Social licence is a key consideration, and one of our challenges, of course, is markets can damage legitimacy as trust. In some circumstances they can build it, but not always. And structure, who's in the market and how big they are, what sort of players they are and whether they're integrated and all these other factors, that matters too. I don't care how good your market design process is. If you've got two players, you've got a problem. If you've got one player, you don't have a market. If you've got two players, you've got a problem, and so on. So we need to be thinking more about structure. Okay, that's a bit of a summary on the end-to-end, and take a moment to digest, think of questions, and then we'll go to sector coupling. Okay? No worries. Okay, let's have a look at sector coupling. What's it mean? That's a fair question, isn't it? The implications of related and emerging industries such as natural gas, hydrogen markets and electrified transport and other sectors, heating is certainly one of those, on energy markets and their regulation. And again, a really interesting and diverse panel in this discussion. Okay, let's first pick up the easy one, which is electricity-gas coupling. Obviously, it's not easy. The first thing, of course, is most electricity industries, including the national electricity market, burn gas as a fuel. So there is a coupling on the supply side of the electricity industry. But of course, there is also a coupling on the demand side as well. And that coupling is really around energy services and those services where people might choose gas or they might choose electricity. And certainly we are seeing the electricity options, whether it's heat pump hot water or induction cooktops, looks like they're starting to eat into gas demand. So it's on both those sides. Now we have far less gas generation transition in Australia than we've seen in Europe and the US and a number of other markets. In fact, if you have a look here, you'll see gas generation's playing, the GPS stands for gas power, okay? It's playing a lesser role. We're actually using less gas. We'll come to why in a minute. And our market's decoupling in some ways in that the Australian East Coast gas market is now very LNG driven. That red there is LNG exports going from nothing to 3 plants sitting side by side in Boyne Island in Queensland, basically consuming, almost, 3 times domestic consumption on the East Coast. And now let's have a look at what's going on with gas. Let's think about markets. We have a gas market problem, okay? It even makes the news sometimes. We're a major gas exporter with really expensive gas. And it bounces around a bit, but basically there are periods where we pay more for gas in Australia than industrial customers in Japan pay. And we have some structural issues, including very significant incumbents, which, as well as this export domination of our market now, which means we pay prices of pure gas importers, despite being one of the world's one of the largest LNG exporters. Should be clear, not gas exporters. Take Russia and some other countries. And that's also having an issue on the demand side as well, because you price up gas and industry leaves or thinks about refuelling and then leaves, and then we also see other substitution happening. So this is a bit of an issue with our coupling, and you may have seen that the Australian Prime Minister and others are trying to push reset on gas in Australia. Let's see if they're prepared to address these structural issues that basically are so problematic right now. But yeah, coupling's obviously got a wider story as well, and so we have coupling of the electricity to heat, to hydrogen, some really interesting presentations this morning on that if you're in that session, through to electric vehicles. Again, that was picked up this morning and I think it's going to be picked up later as well. If you're really going to look at that coupling, of course, it really looks a bit more like that, doesn't it? Because if we think about electric vehicles, for example, there could be a fair amount of generation capacity out there if we've got a big fleet of them. So they're demand, but they may also be supply at certain times. Same with hydrogen, heat, little less so. But the key point is this coupling is enormously promising, but also is adding incredible complexity. And I'll show a couple of examples of couple of ways we think about the coupling. One way electricity industry people think about this coupling is it's just electricity's the game. How does this coupling help or hinder, right? And so you might see something like this. This is from IRENA. And it says, okay, power systems, our big challenge, flexibility. There's things the power system can do about that, build lots of transmission, add storage, demand side participation and so on, but sector coupling to heat and hydrogen electric vehicles basically increases flexibility or the opportunity for it. So that's one framework which sort of came up in our discussions, but the other framework, and this is something Ken was touching on, is considerably broader, of course, right? It's really about a potential electricity hydrogen future where electricity is pretty key. We do a lot of electrification, but there's some things electricity can struggle to do, and industrial processes clearly pick up around that, and mobility applications, discussed this morning. So you can imagine inserting a hydrogen aspect to this. It's actually a little bit of feedback potentially, hydrogen-powered electricity generation, using it as storage. And so this is a much more coupled system. And so when you want to talk about this, now it's a big part of the game, but it's not the only part of the game. And so we're going to try and have to make sense of how this might look in the future. One of the interesting things that came up in the summit was around our gas network. And there's lots of questions around the gas network right now and what its future may be, right? Is it a stranded asset because we're going to electrify and basically they'll just have to pull the pipes out after spending all that money putting them in? Or is it actually a key infrastructure opportunity, right? So we find low carbon or zero carbon gas sources, hydrogen, biomethane, synthetic methane and so on, and suddenly we've got another vector. A vector that not only helps us do some things that we struggle to do with electricity, some mobility applications, some industrial applications and so on, but also provides energy storage back and forth and becomes a key component. That is a really important question for gas infrastructure in Australia and elsewhere, and I don't think we've come to a clear landing on that yet. Interested in your thoughts. One more point that really I think was important about sectoral coupling is a timing one. So you think about basically bringing heat and transport into the electricity sector, and you think about cleaning up the electricity sector, and a really key question then becomes, how do you time these two things? Do we move transport over to fossil fuel dominated electricity sectors? Do we clean up the electricity sector and then we start bringing things across? Or what's the right path through this? And it probably is somewhere along that trajectory, you'd imagine. But you need both those things to be happening. Okay, so hang on. Let me just take a moment to think about sector coupling questions. Oh, I'll take a question right now just to give people a break from me talking. No worries. Okay, hold that thought. So, let's go to the third one. Well on time, I believe there, Chair. So let's go to the third one, which is optimising distributed energy resources. The value of DER. It's a terrible acronym. In fact, one of the first agreements in the session on this was that DER is a terrible acronym. How do you get consumers to engage with DER, right? My daughter laughed. She's a teenager, but she laughed when she heard that term. She was like, can't be serious, right? Anyway, so optimising the value of DER. How do we maximise the value of distributed energy resources? I like this term, while respecting customer interests, right? So, yeah, there you have it right there, right? Optimise for who, okay? And I think Ken's going to pick up on this in some of the equity discussion a bit later as well. Optimal regulatory structures. Yeah, we've got to get the regulation right, we've got to get the markets right, we need new business models and so on. A really interesting and challenging task ahead. And in some ways, of course, it brings the highest uncertainty when we look forward, you know. Sticking renewables into, utility renewables into electricity industry, it's different. But the power engineers kind of get most of it, right? 2 million households in Australia with PV on the roof, exporting into the distribution network. That takes some getting used to. That's a new way of thinking about things. It's sort of interesting in a way because distributed photovoltaics, and Ken raised this, it's about 5% of total generation in the national electricity market right now. So as a market player, you might look at that and go, oh, 5%. Come back when you're 15%, because then you're serious. But even at 5%, we get months where it goes up and down. I think it's gone as high as 8-9% rooftop PV contribution to supply. Clearly that's when the sun's shining and demand's not as high. Late spring, early autumn. But instantaneously, remember, we've got markets that have to deal with this. Instantaneously, it's up to 25%. So we've got 25% of generation which the national electricity market sees as negative load. So it just sees a smaller market for the scheduled generators to meet. If you go to South Australia, sunny, we see big uptake, 30% of households have PV on the roof. We're getting close to 70% of demand at some times being met from household PV. Remember, our market operator has virtually no visibility on that, let alone control. Forget control it, can't even see it, let alone control it. So it's a technical challenge, but it's also a market design challenge. There's a growing amount of stuff that ain't in the market, right? So, now, some people in Australia love using this figure. I really dislike it. And my main problem with it is you should never blend historical with projections without being pretty clear about when it swaps, right? Which I think is around 2018 this report came out. We'll see what happens. But there's certainly some potential that more and more generation capacity, PV, battery storage, electric vehicles with vehicle to grid, we see all that coming back out. And what does the electricity industry look like when you've got more and more of your generation sitting outside existing market structures? In fact, that PV at the moment sits in a completely dysfunctional set of retail market arrangements in Australia, which don't do a particularly good job of incentivising it. So lots of work to be done. Now, this is from the draft summary paper. Fundamental challenges, scale. 300 generators sitting on a SCADA system, supervisory control and data acquisition, runs every 4 seconds. Every 4 seconds. Everything's sitting on the SCADA. Data comes in, control signals can go back to millions of consumer-owned distributed energy resources that may want market access. They may want nothing to do with the market. We'll see what happens. We have technical operation to keep the market going when you see that transformation. And we see we need to move in the way that services get provided. You can't have all that generation sitting out there and, you know, it's got nothing to do with actually making this industry work. You know, oh, that's your problem. You make this thing work. We just want to do what we want to do. You can kind of make it work now, but will you be able to make it work into the future? The other fundamental challenge, really around, it's related of course, everything's related, is around engagement. With distributed energy resource transition, we're relying on consumers to provide system critical services, be it voltage, frequency response, energy balance and so on. The market has traditionally been very low engagement with consumers. I told you about the AEMC's ideas around retail competition. They've moved a long way since then. That was back in 2008. But we still haven't really thought about correct engagement with energy users. There's a tension inherently. Most energy consumers, of course, the electricity's the side thing. Whereas in the traditional industry, of course, if you're a generator, your business is electricity. It's all about electricity. If you're a consumer, your business is, you know, a comfortable house or running your law firm or whatever, or your industrial process. And so electricity just isn't anywhere as high in the list of priorities in engagement. So, lots of challenges around aligning consumers with all of their interests with the rest of the electricity industry. And market design is going to be a key part, but by no means the only part of doing that. Now, let's just start with retail markets and wholesale markets. How are we going to bring them together? At the moment, there's a bunch of what I guess would best be termed social construct tariffs in this retail market here. Okay. And certainly socially constructed network tariffs coming up into here. One thing we can do, of course, is we can say, well, let's send stuff down. Let's let consumers see wholesale market prices. Let's use cost-reflective tariffs, and then these consumers will somehow magically, through the power of pricing, engage. Okay, send stuff down. The other one is send stuff back, all right? Okay. The other thing we can see and that we're seeing is you actually aggregate consumers up and you create virtual power plants and you create aggregate demand response players and so on, and you bring them up into these arrangements here. Now they've both got their uses, and it makes some sense to send prices down. It's not the panacea that we sometimes get argued that it is. And there's certainly opportunities to aggregate up. One of the difficulties with sending prices down is retail tariffs are a social construct more than an economic one right now. That's changing, but it's slowly. A lot of resistance by some consumers. Aggregating up, yeah. First thing is our wholesale market arrangements. You're aggregating up into a mess, okay? So if we had them perfect, it might be better. But also network and local ancillary value, ancillary service value is probably better down in distribution. So if you aggregate up, you're actually losing some of the opportunities that might be sitting down in distribution. There are some new hybrid approaches and so on which are out there. I won't go into the details, but it is interesting. You know, we've got distribution market operators and other sorts of proposed models out there. It's hard to find really good examples of it working so far. But there are trade-offs on complexity versus efficiency. Trust is pretty critical. And I would also argue we risk missing the bigger opportunity here, which is completely rethinking the way that the electricity market and consumers engage with each other. The real thing, of course, is that energy consumers, almost entirely, maybe aluminium smelters are an exception, they want services. They're in the market for services, but they're buying from a market that's kilowatt hour cornucopian consumption market, all right? So that's the bigger opportunity. And possible conclusions, again, this is coming from the draft discussion paper. It's just still being pulled together. One key thing that came out in the discussion is the need for some courage, right? You can kind of faff around with distributed resources, but if you want to really maximise their value, there's some bravery involved. There's going to be a little bleeding edge, perhaps, as well as a leading edge in it. You need to sort of not screw things up now while preparing for the longer term. We're still getting a sense of how these resources are coming through. And some steps around what would need to be an ambitious reform agenda to get this right. Yep, you need a vision. You need a strategy for building trust and engagement. Things that we can do now that help and don't make things worse in the longer term. And then, excuse me, a whole lot of work to try and get that medium to longer term going. So that was the distributed resources bit. So you're probably just sitting in a blur right now, or half asleep after lunch. We had end-to-end market design, we had sector coupling, we had maximising the value of distributed energy resources, and I think, Chair, we have 10 minutes for questions.
Actually, you have 2 minutes for questions, okay? So, yeah, sorry.
I was told 25 minutes and I started at 14 past.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh, I think you went for a bit longer, but we won't argue about that.
No worries.
So, it's definitely going to be an action film, is what all I've got to say. There's going to be a lot happening. Okay, questions?
Hi, apologise from Victoria University. You talked about the increase in TV penetration and DER benefits being captured and shared for everyone. I was wondering what your opinion was on the common statement that people with solar are being cross-subsidised by people without solar in the future. Any views on that?
Yeah, look, I haven't done detailed investigation of that myself. I have seen the work done by Victoria University and ANU and others. It is a pretty complex question, but I think it's fair to say if you've got 30% of households with PV in some states on their roofs, there's some sectors like renters and people living in apartment buildings who are really struggling to participate, but we certainly see low income households that are participating, and when it's basically you can buy a system on your credit card and get it on the roof, it sort of comes in on your credit card limit. I think we're certainly seeing broader participation in household PV than some of the discussion out there about it's just for rich people. Yeah. So.
It looks like you've gone pretty big on hydrogen. So one, in transport, the question is, do you think that hydrogen is going to beat electric vehicles? And the other thing is, are you going to use replace gas generators with hydrogen generators? How are you going to move the stuff around? Are you going to build new pipelines? How are you going to store it? And so on.
Yeah. So first point is I'm old enough to have had 3 waves of hydrogen hype. Back in the 70s, some of that work in Europe and elsewhere about the future hydrogen economy, Amory Lovins and the fuel cell vehicles in the late 1990s, and now this. What's changed? Well, I think a lot, but I still think there are some pretty big questions about hydrogen's future. I think there's clearly some transport applications where I think it may struggle, because I think battery-powered electric vehicles are probably going to be able to do most of what we want done. But we can imagine some other modes of transport, aviation, shipping, long-distance haul, where maybe hydrogen has a more important role to play. There's some industry stuff we need to do where it's hard to envisage doing it cleanly without hydrogen at some point, steel and some others. So I think that's part of it, but you know, the hydrogen economy discussion now comes with a complete decarbonisation discussion. And if you don't have the discussion around we've got to decarbonise, which Ken made the point, then questions of where hydrogen might go, I think it's a very different question. So, yeah, it's really important. Sorry, Richard.
Yeah, Richard Green, Imperial College Business School. Thinking about sector coupling, one of the advantages of making green steel at times when you have surplus electricity is that you get electricity very cheap at those times. But of course, those times, particularly if you've got massive demand for it, may not be that frequent. And then you either get only the cheapest electricity, but very high average fixed costs of whatever capacity you've got making steel or hydrogen or whatever else, or you can increase the cost of your electricity by buying at other times in order to get the average fixed cost of the downstream sector down. And so I don't think it's a no-brainer. I did some work with Helen Hu and Nicholas Vasilakos about 8 years ago, only with a merit order stack and a low duration curve. And the sort of supply curve of hydrogen was quite flat. Somebody probably needs to do a proper model one of these days, and possibly you have already.
Yeah, I might make a quick comment on that. I've been doing a little bit of work around the capital efficiency question for electrolysers is actually a really interesting one. And a lot of the earlier work has assumed you're building an expensive electrolyser, you've got to run it hard, right? You need a good capacity factor to get back your investment. Well, firstly, as we're seeing low-cost electrolysers, particularly coming out of China. But the other thing is, you can actually profitably, well, I'll be careful with profitably, compared to running electrolysers at high capacity factors with higher cost firm electricity versus running them at lower capacity factors with variable wind and solar, low-cost electricity, that's pretty competitive. So we, for example, and others, I believe ANU's done it, and others, we're modelling electrolysers running at 20, 30, 35% capacity factor, but man, they've got cheap electricity and they're competitive. So with the steel making and so on, one of the things, of course, when you're using the hydrogen as a gas rather than electricity, obviously clean steel involves both electricity and you still need to be able to pull the oxygen off the iron. That can be stored. So that does create a pretty good flexibility option for storage of the gas. It's not zero cost, but there are storage options there. Yeah.
So I'm interested in the connection between the second and third parts of your talk, particularly when you talked about aggregation perhaps being negative in some sense. But in the US at least, privacy is a big issue when you don't have aggregation. But then when you talk about adding flexibility to something as big as the grid, I again see some need potentially